Sowendra Shekhar Sahab. He's a novelist and doctor with the state of Jharkhand. He's best known for his collection of short stories, The Adivasi Will Now Dance. He has also won Yuva Sahitya Academy Award for his novel, The Mysterious Ailments of Ruby Basti. Mr. Omair Ahmad Sahab has also joined us. He's an Indian writer, deeply interested in South Asian politics, international relations, conflict management, and study of political Islam. His work, Jimmy the Terrorist, was shortlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize. We're also fortunate to have Mr. Chandrahas Choudhary Sahab. He's a novelist and columnist. His first novel, Arzi the Dwarf, was published in India, Germany, Spain, and America. It was shortlisted for Commonwealth First Book Award in 2010 and selected by World Literature Today as one of the 60 essential works of literature. I also invite the moderator, Ms. Alisha Ibkar. She's an assistant professor in English department, Aligarh Muslim University. She's currently also working on her research work, which focuses on Bengali folk theatre. She's interested in post-colonial literature and Indian aesthetics. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Yeah, I think it's a great honor for me to be sitting with all of you and asking you these questions. So the topic that has been decided for today's discussion is making our voices heard, possibilities in Indian English literature for marginalized social groups. So let's start at a very general note. What is Indian English literature then? What all comes under the rubric? Chandrahas sir?
Well, I had a feeling when I met Omair this morning that this is what he would be saying a lot of the time. Well, I actually meant to start by asking, should we make this distinction for our discussion? Because I don't know about the other two guys, I'm sure it's the same with them, but I hesitate to speak on their behalf. When I think of Indian novels or Indian literature, I don't necessarily make this distinction. And I find in thinking about it, thinking of examples to cite for illustrations or arguments I make, I sometimes I slip between the two, and I don't know, should we ask ourselves first, why do we need to make this distinction, and if there's something valuable about it. As far as I can see, the only thing that's valuable about it is that perhaps you could make the argument with good basis that Indian writers in English, if not necessarily today, but historically always came from usually a middle or an upper class background, or very or background of being very wealthy. And because of that, they had a certain disconnect with the life of people who came from much more marginalized backgrounds, and hence there might be some reason that we have something to prove, that we wrote about some kinds of people, or we did some kinds of work that shows. But I feel like this would be like a trivial point to prove in front when we have so many more interesting questions that we can consider today, such as the kinds that came up in the last discussion. I don't know if
Okay, of course, there's, yeah.
Okay, taken for granted. I'll make two distinctions. One, is the essential question, is English an Indian language? I would suggest that it may now be becoming one. And the distinction I'd make is this. When we think and how we talk with our friends, is the language that is our language. So even when English was studied, used, written by a lot of Indians until fairly recently, it still wasn't the language of primary communication. And you cannot write well in any language unless you can own it, unless you can break it, unless you can say, this is, I have a grip on it. And so that, the question was, who were you writing for? And essentially, writing is, I don't know, for, again, everyone speaks for themselves. Writing is at least to me, also an attempt at communicating something to a larger audience. And if I'm thinking of an audience that is English literate or an international audience, or I will write differently because I know that there's something that some person, I don't have to explain to an audience sitting in India what the Bombay riots are. I don't have to explain Bhopal gas tragedy. I can just put that down. I can just put emergency with the capital M, and I do not have to explain much. If I say Nasbandi, I know what you guys know, because we have a shared experience on that term. But if I'm writing for a wider audience that is not necessarily based out of India, I can't just say Nasbandi and leave it at that. They will not understand. So I think there is something to be said of who we're talking to, and that's a more complicated. I don't know the answer to that. But as Chandrahas pointed out, initially a number of writers in the English language were writing to people who also saw English as their primary language and therefore came from a small privileged class, were either a small privileged class within India or were located abroad. I think that has changed to a large degree in our generation.
I will go with Omair's description. English literature to me is something that speaks to me, but something which does not dumb me down. It is something which talks about my issues, but it does not trivialize them. And yes, that's it. Like for example, there was this. I'll give an example. Like 10 years ago, I read Anita Desai's novel Fasting Feasting, and I loved it very much. Okay. But just a few months ago, I was trying to read her novel Cry the Peacock, and I couldn't go beyond the first 40 pages, although it is barely a 200-page novel. So I do not know how that change came into me, or maybe I wasn't being able to read. But somehow, the second novel, it did not go with me. So it should work with me, the novel.
Okay, of course, Chandrahas, this debate is age-old, right? It started right after, let's say, World War II, when we had some writers like Gugi Wathongo or Derek Walcott who had nationalist concerns. But the debate has again been renewed, with other politics that are now involved in it. Let's say the politics of book circulation, these international award functions or awards that are only, let's say, culturally or financially accepting or giving more attention to books that are written in English. So where are we now with that?
You can always make arguments from 2 points of view in literature. One is that of the individual connection between a single, let's not forget that unlike many other forms of reception, unlike music or cinema, literature is actually no bigger and no smaller than one writer writing for one reader. Even when a writer has 1 million readers, he only has 1 million readers one by one, never all together. They don't all come together to read the books together. And so I think all these questions only go so far up to that river of literature, like the questions that you've just now asked. I would say they have a certain legitimacy, but beyond that, I don't see any reason why somebody who writes in English and somebody who reads in English should either should be made to form part of a larger group that in some way discredits what they're trying to do. Of course, there's then what we're talking about is the politics of language. And the politics, I think what we're seeing now, on the one hand, I would agree with you that perhaps, I'm sure Omair also agrees with me, that as Indian writers in English, we have, at least in the world, we have a much easier place. We slot in much more easily into the Anglophone market. And there's so many writers who are better than us in other languages who, because they have to wait to be translated, often take that much longer in their life to be read by as many people as we are read by sometimes. Against that, there is also a trend that's going the other way, which is that, and this has its own problems, which is that many of us are now bilingual and sometimes badly bilingual. We don't speak very, very beautiful or sophisticated English, and neither do we speak the tongues that we grew up with, the tongues that our family members speak or that our grandmothers speak. What I hesitate to use the word mother tongue because so many of us come from double language families, you know, like where your mother and your father will speak different languages. So I don't see why one parent should have a right over a language that way. And there is something, I think, to me, refreshingly positive about the fact that in India, the Anglosphere historically was a place of the elite. Now it seems to be a place where also the young people congregate in a particular way, and they use concepts which historically were not a part of other kinds of Indian languages. You know, I don't know what the Hindi word for democracy is, but I don't think Loktantra quite describes what we mean by democracy. And in so many other ways, constitutionalism, I don't know what is the Hindi equivalent for that. Yes, and so these are terms which also came up alongside English, and we must not forget that English, whether or not it's an Indian language or not, it also gave us Indian concepts which are today Indian, which can be discussed in English, and which, you know, so to me there's something very exciting about a widening English sphere, which also has to do with the different kinds of Englishes that get written. We are not all the same kind of English writer now, and perhaps that was true 30 or 40 years ago. When I was a student in Delhi University, the English writers we looked up to were all the Vikram Seth, Amitabh Ghosh's, who kind of everybody who had English novels read those. Now I don't think, you know, like when I see people of my generation, the average 25 or 30-year-old writer today, I think is quite solidly rooted in the English language. Whereas previously would always, if you want to see how English novels have evolved, I think we shouldn't go to the great masters because they're always very good, somebody like R.K. Narayan. I was reading recently a writer called Kamala Markandeya, who wrote many novels in the 50s and 60s. And while she's quite a good writer, there's something extremely mannered about her work that makes her almost unreadable today. And there's something peculiar about the fact that somebody who's quite a good writer, yet can find a kind of English that doesn't resonate at all. So these are, I think, the more interesting issues than to make one single line and then say, you know, that's good and this is not good.
What was the question again, Alisha?
Because I talked of the renewed interest in these kind of debates. You see, we have literary festivals all over the country and even outside, and we have these award functions that is mostly paying attention to these kind of write-ups, which are in English. So, would you agree that, or like Chandrahas, you would, take a different path when we say that English is still playing a sort of hegemonic role here?
Yeah, I do think that English is still it still has an advantage. But I do not think I'm in a better position to answer this question because it also depends upon where a writer comes from. Like the place where I come from, I write in English because I was educated in English. But my day-to-day work is done in either Hindi or Amraji, Murshidabad or Bangla Boli in that language. So English is just, to me, it's just a form of expression, nothing more than that.
Okay. So, since Chandrahas also talked about translation, so that also is a very important question that we need to address when we speak of Indian literatures in English or Indian literatures.
I think translation is very important because most of the books which I have read quite recently, and the better ones, I think the better ones are those translated ones. So translation, I think it works.
Yeah, so speaking of translation, let's take examples of Bama's Sangati, let's say that was written in 1994. But then it was translated only in 2009, after which it came to, let's say, the mainstream and began to be incorporated in curriculums and everything. So the subalterns at a certain level are speaking, but are they being translated? Because we're speaking of possibilities in Indian English literature.
So I was having an interesting dinner discussion with a friend who's a German political scientist, Volker Perthes. If any of you are interested in international relations and in Germany, you'd know, but since none of you are, you will not know. Volker and I were talking about his time in Syria, where he'd learned Arabic, and he talked about his travel book that he'd written at that time. And I remarked something about how the British have historically written better travel books than most people. And Volker laughed at that and he said, no, you see, the difference is you come from an English reading world. For those who are coming from a German reading or a Francophone world, there are lineages of very good travel writers. who've never been translated into English. And because English is the larger lingua franca, you just are not aware of it. So your ability it's also because Faulkner had also written a travel book, so that may have been cutting it close to the heart. But the thing is, there's so much we do not know. I think, what's the statistic? About 3% of books are translated, of international literature is translated into English, and therefore globally. And that, for those who are reading primarily in English, that's a kind of description of a vast ocean that we do not have access to. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know how much is translated into Bengali, or into Oriya, or into Urdu, or into Santal, into the various other things. I wouldn't wouldn't necessarily read that much into it, but we should be aware that there are these huge oceans of literature to which we're only peripherally connected. And so when we say something is good, it is only in the context of what else we know is out there.
I attended the Sahitya Academy function in December 2016. And there I came to meet authors who write in different languages, non-English languages, Indian languages. So they told me, yes, they told me, of course, but I learned from them. I would like to say I learned from them that there is a huge readership in other languages as well. And those authors, they are serving their people, and they are doing really a very commendable job in their own languages. So if people are reading in languages which are not English or which are not mainstream, so why would they want to, shift to English? Even that is the question. So if in order to, read those languages, we need to discover those voices. That's it.
Let me give you an example of this, of how context changes your point of view. Now, I presume many of you know that Iqbal ka sher, khud ko karo buland itna ke har taqdeer se pehle. Now, the thing is, if you're reading from a purely Islamic point of view, it's a ground-breaking thing about, khud ko karo buland. The whole idea of khudi is translated in a way that Urdu literature did not tackle it before. But if you read Hindi literature, all of Hindi mythology, literally almost all stories start with somebody doing a tapasya, at which point a deity appears and says, Bolo teri raza kya hai? I mean, that is literally pretty much the start of almost every Hindu myth. So if you look at it from a narrow perspective, Iqbal's stuff is completely out of sync with what's there in Urdu literature. If you marry it within the large context of Hindustani literature, oh, okay, he's incorporated an idea that's very much right.
Of course, there's always this fear of moving towards a monoculture if we keep translating to English and not from English to the other languages. But see, there are problems. Looking at the northeastern writers, okay, none of them were included in curriculums all over the country. Very recently, I think Robin Nangom has been introduced in DU, okay, and he's a translator. He's been writing since the past 15 to 20 years, but he has been included in the curriculum only after he was translated, and that too by himself. Okay, so the problems are there. So since we are speaking of possibilities, what all do we see changing in the coming years, or where do we want to see ourselves going? Chandrahas?
Well, I find I often speak at colleges and universities, and the 2 or 3 questions I always face, like when people translate, is the translation authentic? Isn't the flavor? On the one hand, some people say, like, when no one gets translated, that's so terrible. On the other hand, somebody come and say, well, they got translated, but it's like, how do you know whether the beauty of the original can never be recaptured in translation? And it would seem as if everybody just wants to have some point of complaint at which to then say that I actually realize that this is not worth my time. I think as somebody who's now 37 and who actually grew up in a much more, because my parents, I had a peculiar linguistic background that both my parents have the same mother tongue, Oriya, but because I grew up in small towns around India and Also, my parents were cut off from my grandparents when they got married because my mother's parents disowned her for her act of marrying my father. So we were deliberately kept far away from Oriya culture, and I grew up in a very English-speaking English book world, to which later I began to return also via the pan-Hindi world in which we kind of all grew up in, whether we like it or not. And then thirdly, I returned to my Oriya roots and when I was in my 20s and 30s. And it seems to me it's better to direct this question internally and say, what can we do today as Indians to keep up a genuine bilingualism or trilingualism? Rather, it's clear that we cannot escape English, it's clear that we cannot escape the focus of English, but we can make deliberate attempts within ourselves to reconstitute some bits of identity so that we keep up a link to other traditions. It's very hard, I agree very much with Omair and what he says. It's entirely possible that, people translate across languages from Oriya into Bengali or Bengali into Hindi, and all these have their own networks, these cultures have their own networks. It's clear to me when I travel that readers in, for instance, Kerala or Bengal, the book market is so much bigger than some other states. So we have many different cultures of reading that we should be a little bit careful before grouping into, lumping into larger forms.
Okay, so since we'll try to move a bit towards the general idea of the topic that we are discussing. Hansda, you've been working on tribal literature and you've been writing, as you've written, Adivashis shall not dance. Okay, so we are getting write-ups from these areas, but the subaltern, are they being heard? What kind of space do you have right now?
First of all, I'd like to change this term tribal literature. I'm not doing tribal literature. I'm just doing work, I'm just writing stories and stuff where the characters happen to be tribal. I do not know if this qualifies to be tribal literature or not. Because what kind of characters do you see in what work you usually call tribal literature? Maybe tribals in a village, maybe tribals were still following their traditional ways. But in my stories, we'll have tribal people who are working in cities, who are working in offices, who are, almost economically at par with the mainstream communities. So I do not think I'm doing tribal literature. I'm just writing stories where, my actors just happen to be tribal. So that is one thing. Second, regarding the question of whether these people are being heard or not, I really cannot say because, there are so many books, like I told you about translation, there are so many books from other languages which I've read in English, and I absolutely love them. But before reading those books in English, I had no idea that they were there somewhere. Okay, and these books were not from tribal languages, these books were from Hindi, these books were from Tamil or Kannada. Okay. So now when a book written in such, a widely spoken language is not known to people, can we expect I don't like to use this word tribal, I use Adivasi language. So when we do not know about these books which were written in such widely spoken languages, is it possible that we will come to know about works which are being done in Adivasi languages which are spoken in a few small pockets? I don't think so. So maybe what we should do is discover these voices, translate them. That's it. And yes, the theme of our session here is English English being used as a voice for marginalized social groups. So yes, English works because English is everywhere. We cannot deny that. So that helps.
Okay.
Are the subaltern being heard? So first you'll have to define what does subaltern mean, right? Especially in the context of literature. There's 3 men on this panel. I'm glad that there's a woman moderator. So what about, sadly about half the population of this country is not even represented. So what are we talking when it comes to subaltern? Look, very briefly, this country, unfortunately, learned one of the worst lessons from the British ever, which was the East India Company was based not on fair play, but on access to power. If you were a British person in India during colonial era, you had access to power primarily. If you were an ally to British power, you had second access to power. This was a monopoly company. The John Company and the East India Company were created as monopoly companies. And their principal drive in their constitution was to use power to win mercantilist gains for their shareholders. This is not what is classical economic liberalism. It has nothing of the sort. It's basically about winning wealth and power using violence for a certain set of people at the top. Unfortunately, post-independence, we continued in some senses along this trajectory, especially because we had a top-down model of development, and that devolved into what we once called license Raj. But it still exists today in the sense that who you know matters so much more than what you know. And that means that access to getting to the top is not fair. It's stopped in all sorts of ways. I remember I got a manuscript from a friend of mine who was teaching at Sikkim University, and he said, "Hey, can you please read this?" I read it, and I really loved this guy's work. And the friend who sent it is somebody whose literary taste I have no doubts about. And I read the manuscript, and I was like, "Damn, this guy writes a hell of a lot better than I do." So forwarded it on to my editor at that point of time. But here's the issue of luck. Okay, my editor took that manuscript. This was Chandrahas Choudhary, The King's Harvest, and it won the Tata Lit Fest first book award. And his second book, The Light of His Clan, which I think is far better, is a brilliant book. But it was coming from Sikkim, and Chetan himself is relatively privileged within Sikkim. But still, how does it get to Delhi? How does it traverse these routes of power and mechanisms? And it's in English, right? So it was easy for Satya to email it to me, for me to email it to Ravi, and Ravi to read it. And so English kind of bypassed a lot of those aspects. But it was, at the end of the day, it was an incredibly unfair procedure. Because I only knew Satya because he was my junior in uni. Satya knew Chetan because Satya was posted in Sikkim. And I facilitated that. It is not a matter of whether somebody is good or not. Quite often. Okay, let me say I trusted Satya's taste, and my editor trusted my taste. But each of us read the damn manuscript before forwarding it on, and we put our imprimatur on it saying, we trust the quality of this work. So yes, quality matters, and English eases the process, but a lot of it is still happening because of unfair processes.
Since we're speaking of certain spaces that needed to be given so that people can speak, I mean, I think this is where also the need for Indian literatures came in the beginning, right? Because with these meta-narratives coming into question, I think these smaller narratives that had been pushed to the margins came into, let's say, the mainstream or into limelight. So, I mean, because we were speaking of women, right? So, women, the West's feminist discourses could not do justice to the experience of Indian women or the Indian literatures. So, has Indian literature in general been able to do justice to that kind of space, or has it been able to give them that kind of space?
But what are we speaking of now when we say Indian literature? All the
literatures,
okay,
definitely.
Well, that's a good move, yeah.
Definitely, you'd rather do that. Yes.
Well, you know, one of the reasons why I'm very happy to be an Indian writer is that we have a strange situation in our country. We're one of the few countries in the world where there's so many languages that nobody, not even the greatest scholar of what we would now call Indian literature, has a clue about most of the books that come out. Perhaps the most languages anybody knows in this country is 6 or 7, and we have 2,000 major ones. So in a way, we all are like groping a little bit in the night of Indian literature, and there are some spaces, such as English, where the riches of Indian literature are more visible in other languages, partly because of, as Omair said, there's a certain culture of production and certain economics that allows that people to make those investments, and also because there are 2 or 3 other major languages in India which also have these traditions, and then there's other places where these intersections meet. But it's a very big and very unusual map, which is can't easily be found in other countries. So. In a way, I actually think we are very lucky as Indian readers in that we go forwards and backwards at the same time, back into things that we didn't know. For instance, to me, the greatest Indian novel written in the last 150 years, which is about as old as the Indian novel is something written by this man called Fakir Mohan Senapati in 1902, an Oriya writer. It's a book called 6 Acres and a Third, and it's told not in the first person or the third person, which is typically the 2 ways in which you narrate novels. It's told in the first person plural. It's told as a we. So as soon as you begin reading the novel as an I, you begin asking, like, am I actually being dragged into the we of this village life of this book? This narrator is making all these judgments about women, about lower castes. So suddenly, if someone were to take that book very literally and very disapprovingly, they'd say, well, here's such a pompous, and you would immediately begin to use the language of disapproval today. Here's a narrator who's casteist, who's sexist. Actually, what you're being drawn is you're being forced to agree with all these casteist and sexist propositions so that you may see how bizarre they are. But it's only by actually being drawn into the field of that book, which is such a clever move when you write with using a we rather than I. You're kind of forced to be part of that world. So in these ways, I find like Indian literature is full of all these creative moves, and in a way, I don't think Indian literatures exist out there. Every time we think about Indian literature that exists out there, we're saying, well, that wasn't very well translated. If books are being translated, are people reading them? There's a perpetual process of deferred disappointment. If something arrives to please you halfway down the road, then you look at the step after that and say, well, it really isn't working there. There's another place where Indian literature is very, very good and very, very beautiful, and it's on the way up, which is the individual minds of readers who are serious about finding out what Indian literature is, and not just about what the novel is or what Indian literature in English is. And that space, when I meet readers like that, is when I really feel thrilled at the possibilities of the world, because I think that's what reading is about. That's what that's how we read when we think of world literature. That's another term which perhaps we should have someday a panel about. What's world literature? But in a way, Indian literature is something that's being made right now, and not necessarily in a bookshop, in a publishing house, but being met in the minds of readers. So in a way, we should take advantage of the opportunities that we have today to be Indian readers in that sense. And not just by reading widely in English in translation, but also perhaps trying to explore what possibilities there are. For instance, I don't read a lot in Oriya, and I know to sit down with an Oriya novel would take like years to finish one. But my mother sings Oriya devotional music, and I find it's a very good way for me to practice my written Oriya, to write these songs down, which then I very easily remember. So in practicing the song, I also practice my Oriya and I remember the song. And to me, this is the way in which I can, in singing these songs to my mother when she plays the harmonium, is a small way in which I can be part of Oriya literature. I could never write a book in Oriya. But in these ways, I think if we just look into our family past, into the lives of our street, the linguistic lives of the street that we live in, and the different people who speak different languages there, there's so many ways in which we can redefine Indian literature in ways that are probably constructive rather than just a matter of saying, well, here's another lack, here's another failure, here's another asymmetry or someone. I don't dispute that these things exist, but just by pointing them out, it's not going to solve any problems. And if there's anything, I do feel, like younger Indians today, I feel like we made so much progress in 15 or 20 years from how Indian literature used to be in the 80s and 90s. There's so many more publishers, there's so many people who print their own journals. For a while I used to write for this web-only journal, which you should find. It was bilingual, Pratilipi, which was a very idealistic project that 2 guys came up with in Jaipur in 2006 or 7, and they wrote me out of the blue asking for a write for it. And I used to write literary criticism about any book that came my way for free. But I really found that there's so many more creative ways in which you can make literary patterns today that I don't think we should always be stuck in a rut somewhere saying this or that isn't working.
Yeah, I mean, my previous point on the fact that access is limited by who you know primarily isn't narrow to English, by the way. It is certainly not. The idea of access to positions and to power is a political issue. And it plays out in its own way. I mean, when the last panel was talking about communal politics, at the end of the day, what is caste politics? Caste politics is the limitation of freedom of certain groups of people based on their caste. Gender politics is about the limitation of the freedom of women or other genders. Now we have legally recognized a third gender on the basis of their gender. The dominant caste, gender, creed, whatever you wish to put it, do not have limitations on their freedom. To be a Dalit at one point of time meant you could not have access to the temple, you did not have access to buying land, and you did not have access to education. The basic point is access to equal rights. To be a woman meant that you had limited access to public space, limited access to education, limited access to jobs. That is what gender politics is about. It's about getting an equal access to space and an equal access to rights. When we talk about Adivasi politics, what is it? Is it about a separation of the Adivasi experience from the general experience? It is. It is also the to be able to be recognized as autonomous in their own way, right? As an equivalent, as an equal in some form or fashion. For a lot of, as we are seeing through this election, what is Muslim politics about? A large part of it is, please do not kill us because we are Muslims, or be prejudiced against us because of the religious community that we come out of. It's about just be normal. Part of it is also, look, this is our own creative identity, this is our own cultural space, give us autonomy. But a large part of what we talk about when we talk about various political movements is about respecting the other as an equivalent, as a full human, and therefore not limiting their mobility, not limiting their access to things. That's an important, the reason I'm saying that is, if you look at representation on things, you have all these pictures of great men, but very few pictures of great women. What does that mean? Were there none? When you have all of, look at Jawaharlal JNMC Medical College. Do you know the story of the naming of that medical college? All of that money, all of the negotiation was raised by one man whose name is not carried on that building. Only his portrait hangs in the gallery and is generally ignored. Why? Because somebody said we should name it Jawaharlal Nehru Medical College, and the rest of the people thought, oh, okay, if you reject Jawaharlal's name to the thing, we will be seen as treasonous to India, and therefore it's called Jawaharlal Nehru Medical College, not because Nehru asked for it, but because of this fear of being not equal citizens. In my hometown, there is a park now called Nehru Park, which was called Ismail Park and inaugurated by Nehru, named after my Dadabba. It has now been changed to Nehru Park. Not because, so there's this thing about treating people as equal, autonomous human beings. And that comes from a way of looking at the political structure as an open one, versus a closed one which is open only to my community, to my people who think like me, who look like me, who worship like me. That change is a hard change. We haven't gotten there yet. And literature reflects that. It cannot be divorced from the political structure in which it lives. In a sense, English literature may provide a more open space at times because it is linked to the global climate. So terms like the subaltern. Orientalism was written in English. There's a reason why. And we have imbibed these issues of creative ideas. Even if we may reject some of the issues of Western notions of feminism. Why are we discussing feminism? It's an English word, but the idea is a global one. And the idea of freedom and the idea of equality, of equality, these are global ideas that we have picked up on. And I think Tagore said something about once I accept and value an idea from another culture, it becomes a part of my culture. And that is how we approach the global. And English is sometimes an access point to that. Urdu can be, Hindi can be, Santali can be, depending on how those ideas come about. But you had something else to say, sir.
I have nothing else to say. They're very beautiful answers. Alisha, let's move on. And if it is a question about women, I'm not equipped to answer that, because we should ideally have a woman to answer the question.
Okay.
Yeah, you can answer this.
Question? Okay. So obviously we go back to the first thing that we discussed, that whether or not English is one of our languages now, and also the question of English now trying to be or being more inclusive. But we still see a lot of areas, a lot of areas that are being left out. Let's say speak of the literature of the Northeast, the LGBT communities. Let us speak of disability studies, that is a very recent genre. What kind of possibilities do we see in the future, or what is being done in that area, or the present scope that we have? I remember Revati, one of the most very famous transgender activists from the South, saying that I would have been, let's say, forgiven by the society had I at least born disabled. Okay? And also from the disability studies, we have a number of names. Okay, the specially abled, physically challenged, the latest being print disabled for visually challenged. The nomenclature is fine, but what about the space?
Well, but isn't this a question of politics rather than literature? Yes, but interested in seeing where you're taking this question. Therefore, I accept your proposition. Therefore, what? What for literature?
How do we give them this? How do we give them the space? Is Indian English literature giving them the space that it demands? Because we're speaking of the possibilities that we might have for all the socially marginalized.
Actually, see, Alisha, one of the first stories that I published was an LGBT story. It was written in English. I was in medical college then. It was published in 2012 in an erotic anthology called Alchemy, published by Westland Frank Webber. ठीक है. Why did I write that? Because I got an opportunity. So we should grab opportunities. They're not going to come to us. No one is going to give it to us. ठीक है, मौका मिला, लिख दो. That's it. That's the mantra. You have the language, you have the ability. So why not do it?
Following on that, no one gives rights. You take them. In the game of power, it is, if you do not have rights, don't expect people in positions of power to surrender theirs. They're never going to do that. The corollary to that is, why is freedom of expression so important? And why are dominant groups of various types so scared of it? Because freedom of expression in theory gives everybody the same right to speak. They may speak nonsense. That is all right. But sometimes people who have not been heard are able to articulate ideas that are mind-opening. That is why freedom of expression is so fundamental to any idea of civil politics, of peaceful politics, because it actually allows anybody, theoretically, to get up and say, hey, look, this is my idea. Between the theory and practice comes to, you have to create the space. And articulation is sometimes more sophisticated with those in power. And there are certain ideas that are not allowed in the room and certain ideas that are. So there's a lot of difference between the theory of freedom of expression and the actual practical aspects of it. But I guess what we do is we try to push between the practical limitations to the theoretical applications. And how you do that? Well, I mean, it's unfair, but the honest, true answer is only the marginalized fight for the marginalized.
I mean, of course, when I speak of the LGBT write-ups or the others, I mean, I'm obviously also considering the repercussions that happen, obviously. We know 377, right? And Hansda, after you had written Adivasi shall not dance, we obviously know the repercussions that followed, the legalities of it and the cases
I
that
can never forget that, man.
Of course. So,
I mean, both the book as well as the article. So come on, आगे बढ़ो.
Speak a bit more about the entire experience.
Well, you want
Because
to
like
live
you
that
said,
again?
it's all about fighting for a space and nobody's going to give it to anybody, right?
Hope I don't lose my job over this. But the thing is, it was fun. I got to go to Ranchi and I got to see some films in a multiplex while I was not negotiating. And that's all. I took it in my stride, that's all.
And since we were speaking of space, right, and we are also speaking of access to certain political power or certain political means, I think that is where, I mean, I had the question, I mean, of English being that language. Because it was very recently, I think, because when we speak of space, we're also speaking of the kind of readership that particular book is going to get. And V.S. Naipaul, at an inaugural address at an ICCR conference very recently had said that writing depends upon readership. Had those languages, say Marathi, had books that were great enough, they would have made an impression. So, I mean, are we going to agree to that? Or are we going to say that obviously the kind of readership or the kind of access that books in English have now, I mean, obviously that is not available to the books, let's say, in Northeastern languages. We might have great Northeastern writers like Istareen K or Janice Faryad, but where are they in our curriculums? In the recent anthologies of Indian English literature or Indian literature, where do we find them? Why do we still not have them?
Any of us are academics here? I'm not an academic. Alisha is an academic, so maybe she should answer this question.
By the way, I should say, maybe this is common experience for all the students, there's no surer way not to be read as a writer than to get on the curriculum of any textbook, because that already makes you hated by the time you're 50, like people have left 15 or 16. So, we are now into the question of how is a curriculum formed, which is, I suppose, the parallel to that is how is a canon formed. That to me is a more interesting question, because that involves freedom of many readers rather than just a government authority who's putting a... So, I agree. So, this is what is trying to bring up that, in a way, what we need is a more... a definition of an Indian reader that is more challenging, that's just somebody who says, well, I read 3 books a month, or, what books do you read? Where do you get them? What do you think about, it's so much easier today. Perhaps somebody of my grandfather's generation could, in all legitimacy, say, well, I never left Orissa, and so whatever books I saw in the shop, I read from that. If you bring all these writers to me, like, I don't even know whether these things are part of India or not, and you could have all these defenses that you will sit behind. But today, for people of our age or younger, maybe we should start we should not start off in such a defensive way, and we kind of should, in a way, write maybe a manifesto for the Indian reader. That would be nice, on a page somewhere that every one of us could share about, saying how can we make sure that our library is more diverse, our personal library, not something more about what gets on the curriculum. Those are the things I think we can control, and we have the freedom to control, we have the power to do so. That to me, whenever I go to somebody's house, I kind of look at what they're reading as a way of finding out who they are. And 90% of the time, I have to say, it's a bit of a disappointment. Even very educated people only seem to... This includes academics who only read in one genre, or people, including people who work sometimes for freedoms of certain communities, don't seem to read anything else. And to me, this is not what literature is about. So in a way, I don't think I can give an institutional or large-scale answer to the problem, except to say, of course, when people like Naipaul say that it is obviously completely naive. And it's the same naivete that you see from someone like Rushdie when he puts an anthology of Indian literature in the 90s. There's only one story in translation in it. We can agree that that's very naive without moving on from that to something positive about it. And I suppose the space that then opens up is to say, what can you do as a reader which is what I was trying to talk about. What can you as a reader to make sure? There's a very lovely essay by Amitav Ghosh about, he says, I don't write for readers, I write for my bookcase, which is a very interesting way of saying that you write for the respect, presuming the respect of writers you really love, which are writers from all around the world. In a way, should we also read for our bookcases?
I mean, it's always very dangerous to quote Naipaul. Let me give you an example rather than anything else, as an anecdote. So a couple of my books are translated to German, one of them being Jimmy the Terrorist. And my German publisher decided that he wanted me to go through various German small towns and cities and give talks to that. And I was at one small town whose name now I've forgotten. But I remember one of my German friends said, "Why are you going there? It's like, matlab, I don't know, and the equivalent would be something like Saharanpur, I guess. I don't know, I may be being nasty to Saharanpur. But the guy reading out from my book in German came to me afterwards and said, you know, I really related to this character. And he was speaking in pretty broken English. He was a former pastor who had lived his childhood in his young adulthood in East Germany. And as a Christian pastor, he was relating to a character of a Maulana that I had drawn on from Eastern UP. And we couldn't even really communicate to each other because my German doesn't exist and his English was functionally slightly better. The thing is, quite often, there was no way that he was going to read my book and say, hey, this resonates with my life. If it had not been in German, there was no way that it would have turned into German if it hadn't been in English in the first place. The experiences I was writing about were principally lived in Urdu or Hindi. So there were multiple steps between being able to resonate, to understand, look, hey, this experience in this part of the world, and we do not associate 60s, 70s Eastern UP with 60s, 70s East Germany in any way whatsoever. Certainly not a pastor and a Maulana. That there are resonances, we just don't know about it because we just haven't managed to read that much. And so primarily the challenges for literature are always about recognizing that there is so much out there that we may be able to catch somehow. And we'll only learn that by trying to widen our libraries.
Yeah, Hansda, some concluding remark, because then we'll open the house for questions, right? Some concluding remark on how we can do that. I mean, increase the limitations of our bookcase for readers, for our young readers.
Look, if someone has to do it, they will do it. We did not go and tell people that, yeah, you have to do it. किसी में अगर इच्छा है तो वो कहीं ना कहीं से बाहर आएगी ही, ठीक है? Yes, थोड़ा सा माचिस जला सकते हैं हम लोग, ठीक है? लेकिन रोशनी अपने आप करना पड़ेगा. That is my.
I think now we'll take questions from the house. Anybody?
First of all, Chandrahas, we'll take you up on the Reader's Manifesto, Readers of the World Unite. I have a very particular question for Omair Ahmad. Since we're talking about marginalized voices, I think there's no voice more marginalized than that of a person accused of terrorism. And because terrorism is such a totalizing category, the moment you employ it, it conjures a certain image. And it's very difficult for, to maneuver any space for any other image there. How difficult was it working with such a totalizing terminology, and how difficult is it to try and, reshape it to signify something else maybe?
I'd be a little careful by saying most marginalized.
One of that.
One of. Because when we say that, we kind of limit everybody else out. And we can't speak for everybody's experience.
There's a politics to saying that.
There's a politics to saying that. I chose Jimmy the Terrorist as a title, specifically for the reason that you say, which was to subvert it. And I don't know, I mean, honestly, it was very easy. And the reason I say that is I had the full backing of my publisher. The Man Asian at that time was looking at unpublished manuscripts. So it was shortlisted as an unpublished manuscript. So it already had backing there. And then when it was published by Penguin, with one of their prestige labels, Hamish Hamilton. And it went on to win the crossword thing, and sure. So in a lot of ways, it was dramatically easy for me. And I don't know, maybe that's also a lesson that sometimes we think these things are harder than they are going to be. It wasn't at all. Maybe people were crying out to read something of that sort.
Good afternoon, sir. My question is for Hansda sir. Sir, as you relate to both medical science as well as literature, so how can medical science in collaboration with literature work for the social marginalized groups?
I do not think of working for the socially marginalized group. My first effort always is to, do whatever I'm doing, whether I'm doing it in the medical field or whether I'm doing it in writing. ठीक है? What has to come after that? वो बात की बात है. पहले अपना काम पूरा कर ले.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, sir. Sir, all three of you have written about the social groups, the minorities in your novels, in your books. So after they were praised so much, did you notice any change in the views of the people or as a whole of a society regarding their anti-mentality of the marginalized groups?
No, I think this is to presume a very direct, it's almost on the model, if I slap you, then you're going to slap me back kind of model of feedback, which I think it would be very ambitious or presumptuous of us as writers to expect that we wrote about some people today and by tomorrow the entire society has been changed and everyone behaves so nicely now. I don't think that's so much the point. I think the more interesting side to your question is what draws somebody to write about somebody who's different from you, and that to me is the heart of the question of why we write in the first place. So that to me, rather than trying to work out a model of how when you wrote about a marginalized group, whether other people who are not marginalized then began to think differently about the marginalized, which seems to me to draw in so many different kinds of forces that don't necessarily align with one another. It's more interesting thing that when somebody writes about somebody who's different from them, what kind of process of imagination that work, and to speak directly of the text itself. I think that's a much more interesting space in which we can try to think about how we think about each other than to look at its effect in the world, isn't it? In a way.
You and Chandra said this earlier. You never get a feedback from all your writers. You certainly don't get a feedback from the world. The world doesn't mail you a letter and say, I have changed my views having read your book. Occasionally you'll get a person. I worked with a German organization for a number of years, and after reading Jimmy, one of my line managers said, I completely understand this, because this to me was like as a Catholic in a Protestant country, I understood this relationship. And maybe that was also because I had read so much on the literature of communities such as the Jewish community in not so much in Germany per se, but also in America and in France and in the Netherlands, which had their own experiences. And so I was drawing on other literature from other communities. And he, in it, was able to relate from his own community perspective. That's about as much as one can hope for. as a writer. You can't. The world isn't going to send us emails.
I will not be modest here. I'll just say that yes, I received a lot of praise for both the mysterious ailment of Rupee Basket as well as the Adivasi will not dance. And my Facebook, in my Facebook account, my other folder, the folder which we do not usually see, that would be full of messages from readers who would say that yes, my stories and my writing especially, there were two non-fiction pieces I wrote in Mint Lounge and the Hindu Business Line about my hometown Ghatshila and the place where I work, Pakur. So I did a comparative study kind of a thing. So I received an email from a person who was in Australia right now, and he told me how much that meant to him because I think some of his family, they worked in Ghatshila. So when I receive praise, yes, it is, I feel very good. But like I said earlier, I never, I never wrote thinking that I'm from marginalized community. I just happened to write stories which were about marginalized people. So that's it.
The question I'm going to ask Omair first. Weren't you accused of being a terrorist sympathizer after writing that novel, number one? There's another question here. Coming to politics of language and translation, what is your take to all of you about, how do you think that Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he was not given the Nobel Prize, but people thought that he should have been given the Nobel Prize. And he started writing in his mother tongue, and as an act of resistance against hegemony within quotes of English. So what do you think about that? And don't you think that if a writer writes in his mother tongue, in his or her mother tongue, then she's rendering a service to her mother tongue? And there's another question I have to Hansda. Did you try to tap anything which tribals tell, maybe as part of their oral tradition? And another one, I have too many questions and I'm forgetting them. And there's one fact I perhaps missed, that is Chandrahas. Did you claim that there was some first novel written in Oriya in 1902?
Well, it wasn't the first novel written in Oriya. It was just a novel that was written in 1902.
Okay, sorry, I missed that actually.
Actually, the people who blame me for being a terrorist sympathizer don't really care about the book. The people who want to be bigoted will be bigoted. It doesn't really matter to them what you've done or what you haven't done. It doesn't. It has no correlation. For the book itself, I do remember there was one person who said, "But sir, these terrorists that you have spoken to, do they think like this?" And I had to explain to the person, look, this is a work of fiction. It doesn't have to do with, I'm not telling you the life story of a real person. That's about it. Beyond that, I can't answer the other questions which have to do with translation.
Regarding the oral traditions, yes. I did not use much of oral storytelling in my second book, the Adivasi will not dance, but in the mysterious element of Rupee Basket, yes, there were a lot of stories which I heard from my family and, village gossip and all, and those are upon which I built my entire book.
Very quickly on this question, it's an interesting example to bring up. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer, who many people say should be given a Nobel Prize. Actually, I meant to say as a suggestion to all of you, I read his 3 volumes of memoirs last November because I was writing a review about it for a newspaper. And I can't say I've ever read a better evocation of what it's like to be a humble peasant boy who doesn't go to an English medium school and to work his way up through the world of education, to even go to school for the first time and then be accepted in university. And there seem to be many things that he was saying which is like analogous to what we face as Indians, about how to you participate in a language and a culture that in a way kind of oppresses you. At the same time, there's resources within it that free you and allow you to think in a different way. So if you can find these memoirs in your library, you should read them. But with regard to your question, I don't agree that his gesture to me doesn't make sense, because in a way he started writing in Gikuyu, which is what he went back to, after he was very well known as an English writer. So in a way, he could kind of separate himself from the rest of the Gikuyu writers as someone who's already very well known. To me, that doesn't have the same resonance at all, and it doesn't seem to me to be a very meaningful gesture. It may just be that he himself felt there were some things he could say in Gikuyu that he couldn't do in English anymore. And maybe he has two lives, as two writers, as an English writer and as a Gikuyu writer. Maybe that is a better way of seeing it. I have to say, I'm one of those Indians who absolutely don't believe in the concept of a mother tongue, and I don't like being held back to. I meet so many people in Orissa who say, you know, if only you're written in Oriya, you'd be a better writer. I think I'd be a much worse writer, one. And two, you know, like, we're not obliged. I mean, it's just another kind of pressure. You know, you're not obliged to. You only have responsibility to the language that you love. And no responsibility in literature can be forced upon anybody. There may be a certain value in reminding people that they're bilingual, perhaps in saying, like, shouldn't you be writing in the mother tongue? But this very idea of a mother tongue, we are trying to create a more inclusive, the theme of our panel is how to make a more inclusive society. Part of that, I would imagine, is intermarrying across castes and across languages, across cultures, across states. The more we do that, the less there will be a mother tongue for anybody, and the less there will be a mother tongue to write in. What we need are tongues that you love and you believe in.
Also, I'd like to add to this one. There shouldn't be any question about in which language one writes, because you see, in my opinion, one should write in a language one is comfortable in. One shouldn't be like an activist kind of a thing that, nay, I have to boycott this language so that I can promote this language. No, write in whichever language you are comfortable communicating in, because writing, in my opinion, is itself an act of resistance. It is itself an act of activism. Because you are writing, you are trying to voice your opinion. Isn't that what we do when we are doing some activism kind of a thing? So writing itself is, a huge thing.
Good afternoon, sir. As we can see that while the most of the countries do their most of the works in their local languages, but why it is that many of the educated Indians feel embarrassing to work in their local languages, like while publishing research papers or holding a seminar?
Maybe because of a colonial history, maybe because we have been told that people who ruled us, their language was superior. And maybe also because in India we do not have any one local language. India is, such a heterogeneous place. We cannot differentiate here. So we needed some kind of a link. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, let's also be very clear. India isn't a country of one language. No other country also is. France has a really brutal history of how it taught what is now called French to its own periphery. Forget it, the rest of the world. So the idea of language nationalism is a bit dodgy in that sense. I do think that there's a huge possibility of learning from languages. So I mean, even if I do not understand and cannot speak Urdu fluently in the same way as my father or grandfather could, and my father spent half his life saying, well, you have to write, why did you learn Farsi? Because that's actually a literary language. Everything else is crap. But there are certain concepts that are instantaneous to a particular language. How do you explain the term behuda in English? There is no translation for that term. Right? How do you, I mean, because had ko paar karna, if you see it in an English term, is to cross boundaries or, it actually has hugely positive connotations. In Urdu or Hindi, apna had janna or is intrinsic to just being a normal, polite human. And so to be able to know these concepts in multiple languages helps us in thinking through complex ideas. So I do think it's very important to know and understand the languages that you have. I do not believe that means that you can only express that in one language.
this is something I personally struggle with quite a lot as well. When you were talking about freedom of expression, how long do we tolerate the intolerant? How long, for instance, even through writing, people, the marginalized are further oppressed. How long do we let that go on? How do we oppose it? And
I just have one answer to this. Do not tolerate intolerance. Oppose intolerance.
I'm a free speech radical. I believe that once you give power to people to start limiting speech, it'll be only the powerful that get to limit the speech of the powerless. Exactly. Right? So I think it's a complicated place to be. At the same time, I realize that quite often when you give free speech fully, it is the people in positions of power that abuse it to attack those in positions of powerlessness. Nevertheless, I would still lean toward giving more and more people equal access. Where free speech becomes dangerous is where people in the name of free speech argue that the other person is less human, has less rights to full humanity. That's when it crosses that line. Can we make that into a law? I do not think so. I think that becomes dangerous because that gives people in entrenched power ability to control you. But if you want to assess something, whenever you see a piece of speech that says that some people are less equal than others, that's when you know that person is an idiot and is not worth conversing with. That is the end of conversation.
So I think that is it for the questions. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Hansda, Omair and Chandrahas. We had a lot of disagreements, of course, but we can all hope that it was, for us to become more inclusive of all literatures, Indian literatures, and it was also a good thing that you all got an advice that you increase the parameters of your bookcases and also your intellectual thought. So thank you everyone. Thank you.
That was indeed quite a panel. I'd like to take this moment to thank the panelists for the excellent discourse that was stimulated in the discussion. I thank you, Chandrahas Choudhary Sahab, Hansda Sownendra Shekhar Sahab and Omair Ahmad Sahab. I'd also like to extend my gratitude on behalf of the University Debating and Literary Club to our moderator, Alisha ma'am.
We would also like to thank the audience and the moderator, all three of us.